It go like, oh, rate me for so fucking done with you, girl. So fucking done with all the gang.
And concerning as it may be, there is evidence of foreknowledge of the purported shooting that took place in Sandy Hook. Plain and simple, web pages with details of the event were put online before the event took place. And the websites where these pages appeared were the official websites of well-known organizations. This evidence of foreknowledge has been met with some of the most belligerent arguments that claim this is untrue. The most common argument being that we simply lack the knowledge required to analyze the data. Data in these cases refers to the cache of a web page kept by search engines like Bing and Google. So before I get to the evidence of foreknowledge itself, let's identify a few terms and definitions that will help you gain a better understanding of a topic you may or may not be that familiar with. Google is a company that provides many services, but for our purposes we're going to focus just on their web search service. When you search the web for a word or phrase using Google, Google presents you with a series of pages that best match your search criteria. The results are ordered by how close they match, so results on page 1 should be better or more relevant than those on page 20. What is Google providing links to? What are these results? Most results linked to by Google are simply web pages, although some of the results will be PDF, Microsoft Word, or other documents. Google's proprietary technology determines when and where those results show up. Since the vast majority of results and the evidence in this case are web pages, we'll limit our discussion to those. Google uses a very complicated and private method of choosing which results to display and the order in which to display them. The system is ever-changing and increasingly more sophisticated to abate abuse of the system. Google has detected and prevented the most clever of tricks over the years. Why would anyone want to manipulate Google's system? Imagine if you were a company that sold widgets online and had 20 web pages that advertised your widget. Imagine if, through some gaming of the Google system, every search at Google always produced links to your 20 pages before any other pages. Whether the search was Angelina Jolie or quantum mechanics, your pages came up. Although this is an extreme example, you can see how this might be desirable. How do web pages get into the results shown by Google? Before a web page can be presented as a search result, Google must first become aware of the page and index it. Then, all the various features of the page and its content can be analyzed so it can be included in search results when appropriate. This function is performed by Googlebot. Beginning with the pages it already has in its index and adding new page maps of links provided by site owners, Googlebot scours these pages for any changes and links to any new pages. Once complete, Google's index is updated accordingly. This process is ongoing, involving many bots and many billions of pages. With that background under our belt, let's examine how to determine the date that a page was last indexed by Google and what that page contained at that time. When Google visits a web page for the first time, determined by a proprietary criteria, Google may capture and store a copy of that page. You can access the cached version of a web page by clicking the link labeled Cached, shown with most search listings. Each cached page is assigned an ID and the date it was last cached. Pages that are more popular will be cached more often. Each time a page is cached, the date is updated, and if the page is changed, the new content will overwrite the old. What constitutes a page is ultimately determined by the URL address of the page. So, if a page exists that is identical in every way to another except the URL is slightly different, Google will index it as a separate and unique page. If the URL of a page is changed in any way, then Google will consider it a new page. Even if the content of a page remains the same, a change to the URL will cause Google to index it as a new page. At around the same time, it will remove its former reference to a page. Some pages may be indexed and usually cached as well by Google once, but never qualify to be indexed or cached again, based on a number of factors. In these cases, the cached version of the page and the date of cache may be as old as 9 years. Google is not concerned with certain things that may be contained within the URL, like dates, for instance, other than keywords and phrases it will use to determine the general content of the page. So, if you were to create a page with a URL containing the date 7/15/1999, Google will still use the current date when indexing it. Google always records the date their bot visits a page, without exception. Hopefully now you understand the basics in a theoretical sense. Now let's look at some real-life examples to see if we can definitively determine if there was foreknowledge. And we'll begin with a smoking gun example that would stand up in court. While we're at it, we'll take note of just how far one person went to confuse people and hide the simple truth. It all began when the website for the Arlington Red Devils posted a web page on their site with a link to a document entitled A Guide on How to Talk to Children About Sandy Hook. The guide was originally published by Crisis Management Institute. The date of the article shown on the page itself is 12/10/2012. The URL of the page also includes that date. As we just outlined, the only date that we can truly rely on to tell us when the page was last accessed by Googlebot and indexed is the date it was cached, or the cache date. To see that, we simply find the cached link for the page, and when Google's cached version of the page loads, that date will always appear in Google's disclaimer box right at the top of the page. Remember though, the cached date is updated each time Googlebot returns to visit the page. So going through this process after almost 2 years would likely show a much more recent date. But thankfully, many people were curious enough in the days immediately after the event to grab a screenshot of what the page looked like back then. And those screenshots show Google's cached date for the page as 10/13/2012, 1 day prior to the actual event. So, let's add it up and see what we have here. Disregarding the content of the web page itself, which we've learned can be changed over time, we start with the URL of the page. As you can see, the URL contains the phrase, "talking with your children about the Sandy Hook tragedy." That can only be a specific reference to the Sandy Hook shooting event. Next, we see that Google reports a cached date of 12/13/2012 for that URL. Remember, URLs can't change or Google considers it a new page. And I might add that just because we see clear evidence that Google had last indexed the page on the 13th, it's very possible the page had been indexed earlier, say the 10th, at which time Google's cached date would have shown the 10th. Case closed. Here we have an irrefutable example of foreknowledge of the event by at minimum 1 day. Now let's see how this simple bit of deduction was extrapolated into a book-length investigation that, despite its length, never came to this conclusion. A fairly popular alternative news site, Fellowship of the Minds, ran an article back on January 13th of 2013, reporting that this same webpage appeared to have been online 4 days before the Sandy Hook event. The article caused a stir and racked up many comments. But a few days later, an update to the article was added, explaining that many comments had been received, but one in particular, from a person named Peter Offerman, seemed to provide more insight. So Peter's comment was featured, which began an odyssey of endless technical jargon. This first article garnered 167 comments before comments were closed. Many of those comments were chapter-length diatribes by Mr. Offerman that danced around the technical details of everything from blogging systems to web servers, each promising to provide the conclusive evidence in the next issue. This went on for a further 3 articles and nearly 200 further comments. It was clear to me when I posted a comment to the first article that Mr. Offerman was clearly attempting to confuse the issue and doing a very good job of it. The owner of the site, who happens to have penned the 4 articles, was likely dazzled by the display and unfortunately taken for a ride. But the evidence was clear. Everyone's familiar with the United Way, and it's not surprising that they established a fund to solicit donations for those impacted by the Sandy Hook event. But it appears they too jumped the gun on the event and published their webpage advertising the fund well in advance of the event. In the case of the United Way, a page was noted in the Google search results entitled Sandy Hook School Support Fund and was published to their website for the Western Connecticut region. Unfortunately, I couldn't locate a screenshot taken early enough showing Google's cache date for the page. However, we do see Google's document date of the page shown as December 11, 2012. This isn't definitive since Google may derive that date from the page content, which is subject to change. In some instances, the date is grabbed from the page where the date is actually connected to another article simply linked to on the page. When I examined a copy of the page, I found no dates whatsoever. In those cases, Google claims to revert to the cache date. But since the document date of 12/11/2012 isn't definitive proof of foreknowledge, we need to dig deeper. The website insanemedia.net has done extensive research into this topic and provides us with some important clues. First, they report that the United Way has responded to allegations of foreknowledge and flatly rejected them. But this is where it gets interesting. Subsequent to that, a public relations firm contracted by the United Way forwarded an email to the Daily Caller from an engineer at Google reading as follows. This is a technical glitch on our end. The date Google's search engine first saw the page was 12/14/2012 at 6:58 p.m. We're looking into a fix, but it may take some weeks. Being somewhat of an expert in these matters, I can say that this explanation is utterly ridiculous. In fact, I find it very difficult to believe that a Google engineer would make such a claim. But given that this is presented as the official explanation from the United Way's perspective, let's see if there's any other evidence that would support that. As shown right on the page in question, the United Way Fund was actually established by the Newtown Savings Bank. Not surprisingly, the president and CEO of the Newtown Savings Bank is John Trentacosta, the very same Trentacosta that owned the home next door to the Lanzas and where all the activity was taking place on the morning of the event. Mr. Trentacosta is a bigger fish than some might think, as he's a member of an important council at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Mr. Trentacosta is quoted as saying, "The fund came together as a response to countless requests, presumably to counter any criticism that the fund was simply a fraudulent scheme, but that's just speculation." However, the statement does present a problem. We know from the Google engineer's statement that the web page soliciting donations for the fund was indexed by Google on 12/14/2012 at 6:58 p.m., the very evening of the event. How much earlier than that time was the page first put online is unknown. But in any case, one has to wonder how it was possible in such a short time to first receive those countless requests, come up with the concept for the fund, meet to plan the whole thing, establish the bank account to collect those donations, coordinate with the United Way, determine the slogans and taglines for the campaign, create the artwork and the web pages themselves, and finally to get all of that up and running online. If it were possible at all, it would be a world record. I don't know how many people have donated, but the total taken in is in the millions. I find the explanations given to account for how quickly this fund was put together to be dubious. In the end, it may be this potentially fraudulent fund and the legal pursuit to reclaim those donations made by innocent people who were simply duped that becomes the first domino to fall in the greater fall of the Sandy Hook hoax.